Welcome back, everyone. This is Ayad Boudiab, and we are continuing our Angular course. There are a few things that we've been talking about recently. Specifically, I've been discussing the custom directives that we can create. I recently gave you an example on how we can build one of those custom directives, but as I said at the beginning, we were still scratching the surface on those directives because there's so many different ways we can do things, and it's very powerful on how we can build those directives. So you need to spend some time exploring it. So the previous example does not give you the details that you need. In today's example, I picked up one from the Angular website. So what you see right now in front of you is just an exact example from the Angular website, but I'd like to discuss that with you because it just kind of explores some of the details that we can work with when we're creating directives, and discussing it always helps so we can know what type of detail are involved in creating such directives. So to start with, we're creating this custom directive that has to do with date time, and it displays the current date time on the screen, and it also displays the format that you can have it displayed as. So let me show you the actual screen and how it looks like when you run the application. Here it is. You would see that you have the format, and then you have the current time being displayed. As you can see, it's updating every second, right? And it just displays the date time in that specific format. It's month, day, year, and the hour, minute, and second. So if I go over here to the text and I type another M for the month, notice this one became 09 over here because I specified 2 digits for the month, right? Here's the day, we get year. I can also type a couple more and one more, and you have 2014 being displayed as the year. So as I change this format here, it's reflected down here. The second thing is every second the date is being reflected. So there are two things in here taking place. So we need to go back to the code then, kind of explore that a bit and see what's going on. Here's the code. Let's go through it line by line, and then we'll start first with the body. It helps to look at the body first and see what type of directive we're dealing with. We have a div. The div has a controller named controller. So I'm expecting up here to have a controller, and I do, named controller with a capital C, right? And usually in my discussions, I name them something. For example, student controller, employee controller, things like that. But as I said, this example is straight from the website, so I didn't change anything in it. So this is the controller. This is the div. I'm using that inside here, right? This is the scope would apply to this set. It has a date format, an input box for the user to type something, and that's true. That's what you saw over here, the user to type something after the date format. And then the ng model is the format. So basically, whatever that format value is being displayed in here. We've discussed ng model before, right? So you see the model as being part of the text being displayed. Okay, now the second thing is the current time is, and you notice in here we're using a span, and then within that span we have an attribute called my current time and equal to format. So we're using whatever that format is to be the value of this attribute within a tag, a span tag. Okay, so this must be my custom directive, and this is the value being passed into that custom directive. As we have discussed in the previous lesson, when you create an attribute to a HTML5 document, you put a dash in between. So my dash current dash time. That's how you display it, right? So what we would expect is up there in the code within my directive, I should have my current directive and my current time, as the name of the directive, and the dashes are gone, and we're using the camel case, right? Okay, so that's what's going on within the actual body of the HTML document. Let's go up to the top and discuss what's going on within the code. Angular.module, we're creating a module, name, in this case, my custom directive app. And in the top for the HTML, my ng app is custom directive app. We have a match in there, so that's good. We have the normal reference to AngularJS. We haven't changed anything there. Now the module does not depend on anything, so it's an empty square brackets. And as I mentioned to you before, even if it does not depend on anything, you have to specify the square brackets as empty. Then we need to add the controller, right, to the module. So we chain our commands .controller .directive, right? Okay, let's start with the controller first. The controller is named controller, and that's why we reference that as the ng controller here. And then the controller depends on the scope. We pass the scope to that function, and we add format to the scope. So now format should be part of the scope. And sure enough, what you saw down here is we're using format as part of the scope. All right. The format has the value M, D, Y, and so on. That's what you saw when I first loaded the page before I start changing these values. Month, day, year, it displays month as 9 instead of 09. So that's done. The format is part of the scope. So far, so good. Now that I have declared my controller, first I start with a module. I added the controller. The controller depends on the scope. I added format to the scope. Now comes the core part of our discussion, which is pretty much adding a directive. And remember, the directive that I use is basically attribute based, because I can create one element based. But in this case, we're using an attribute based directive, and it's called my current time in here. So you sure see here, sure enough, you see my current time in camel case displayed up there. All right. Now the directive depends on the interval service. Okay. So basically, we'll talk about services later in our course, and they are core part of what we need. Right. It's a service. It's provide us with something, so it can handle things for us. And in this case, we're saying we're using the interval service, and the interval service is pretty much like the timeout that you use within JavaScript, but it is better handled in Angular. That's why I need to rely on that interval service. And then it has the date filter, and this is the function. You notice in here, scope as a service, and then we pass the scope to the function. The same way here, we have interval as a service. That's my current directive depends on it and depends on the date filter. So when I create my function, I have to rely on interval and date filter passed in as parameters, because obviously I need them within the body, right? And here's interval. It's highlighted. You see it is being used. And the date filter, if I highlight it, you see it is being used. And as the name implies, date filter is a filter, and you will see how that works. So now my current time directive is being created, and you see the opening square bracket here. You see the closing down there, right? So this whole thing is my directive. Okay. So then the second thing that's important to me is that the directive that usually the one that manipulates the DOM, and that's what we're doing, right? We're manipulating the DOM over here, because every time I change something here, the DOM would change, right? So we are manipulating the document object model. Every time you do this and you need to manipulate the DOM, usually use the link option. And this is the link that you see here. And that's why down here it says link is the function link being created. Don't be confused. You can name this one anything you want. You can call it my link function. If you name this one my link function, you can name this one down here my link function. But what's important is that that's what you're returning as part of this directive. And as I said, you need to use the link option because you're manipulating the DOM. Okay, that link option, this is the link function here that you create, and that link function is the one that does the work for you to do something, and in this case we are manipulating the date based on the formats given to us. Okay, now as you can see, the link function is already predefined that basically takes 3 parameters to it. The scope, which is the angular scope object that we normally deal with, and then the actual element, which is the element that this directive is trying to match, and then the attributes, which is basically a like a key value pair, right? And it contains some information. I'll show you how that displays when I load the page in the debugger. So these are the 3 parameters that this function depends on, and then we define format and timeout ID as variables within the function. Now, don't be too confused, because you see function here, you see function there, and you see what's going on. Well, functions are the key part of JavaScript, right? So in this case, when you create this function, it's as if you're saying I'm creating an object, right? So you can put a function within a function. All right, so within this bigger function in here called link, we're creating a function that says update time. As the name implies, is going to update the time, right? And you can see here, it's updating the time here, and it's updating the time there. If you don't mind, I'm going to jump down here and show you what I'm talking about before I continue the rest of the discussion. You notice in here we're using the interval service. And I told you the interval service is basically like you use that in the timeouts in JavaScript, but it's better handled in Angular. This Angular service called interval use that function to do something over a specific time. In this case, over a 1000 millisecond, which is a second. Every second, I want you to call update time. So the interval service is saying, what do you want to do? You're saying, I want you to update the time every second. All right. Now, why are you then declaring a variable called timeout ID and you are storing that here? Well, I'm returning whatever that function is. We're storing that in timeout ID, so that way we can release that memory later, because otherwise we'll have a memory leak. So when the element that we're operating on has an event in here, it says on destroy. That's destroy, also a service provided to us for every element that we're trying to destroy, right? So when the element is destroyed, I want you to cancel the interval. What interval do you want me to cancel? The one that I just created in here based on that timeout ID. Okay, so once again, the element that you're passing in as a parameter, part of the link, is attaching an event to it. This is the destroy event. That's the service provided to us through Angular, and it's saying when you want to destroy this element, I want you to cancel the timeout interval that keeps updating every second. Okay, so if this cancels here, then based on that timeout ID, then we're done. We don't have memory leaks anymore. Okay, let's go back up here. So then every time that interval happens, I'm updating the time. Well, how are you updating the time? We're doing this by saying element, which is the element being passed in, which in this case that's the span, right? For that element, I want you to change the text, right? When here, Angular depends on a minified version of jQuery called jQuery Lite, right? It has its own functionality, and this one is just saying I'm changing the text for that element, right? What are you changing the text to? I'm changing the text to that new date, which is the current date and time, using the date filter to format it the way I want it to format it, right? After you give me that date format in my current format that I have chosen, which is the format being passed in here, which is the format that's part of the scope, right, up here, I want you to format it in that way and then store that as a part of the element text. Okay, so this is what the update time is doing. So this is happening every second. Now we resolved one issue though. Every second the display is changing, but which one does actually update when I change the year, because in here I can remove the year and it says 14 down here. So there's something else changing the DOM other than the every second event that's taking place. So my changes to the text box is actually being reflected in the DOM. Well, this is happening in the scope watch. And here you're saying, I'm watching the my current time, and I'm going to use a function. When you pass me that value, which is the format, I'm going to update the time. Right? So every time you change the text box, you change those values, I'm going to update the time as well. That's why the text below, which is down here, is actually updated, because I'm using the watch service in this case, which is I'm watching that any changes in that attribute key value pair, and I'm reflecting that through the update time. Okay, one thing I was mentioning to you that I can provide to you as information is over here. When this is happening, I can basically go to the tools, and then I can look at the developer tools. And when I load the developer tools, I see the code. Right? This is in the source tab. In the source tab, I can always add a breakpoint. Right? So I can go over here. And here's the link function that I'm talking about. On line 14, inside that function, I'm going to put a breakpoint. I'm going to reload my page, and you notice, sure enough, it stopped at that breakpoint, right? Because it's happening every second. If I hover over scope, it will tell me what that scope is, right? You notice in here the format within the scope, you notice the ID, you notice all the information that you need pertaining to that scope. You can also see the element, right? This is the span element. And you can also see the attributes, which is the key value pair. You notice in the attributes as being an object, and part of the attribute is my current time, which is the directive that I'm trying to manipulate, which is my current time, right? So every time that changes, I'm going to apply the update time. I can always remove that breakpoint. I can always go to the other information down here. I can add to the watch, or I can say update time. And I can put my my breakpoint over here as well. I can continue. I hit that breakpoint. I can look at other information. This is the format that I'm passing in as a parameter, and so on. So my point in here is that if you want more details, you can always go to the developer tools. And by the way, maybe I didn't show you that clearly when I was loading it earlier. I click here, and then I can go to tools and then developer tools, or this is called the F12 developer tools, which means you can hit the F12 key on your keyboard, and it will load that that developer tools down here. You can go to the source tab. You see the source on the left. You click on your file. It displays here. You put your breakpoints by clicking anywhere on those lines on the left-hand side, and then you can click on them again to let them go away, and then you can reload your page to be able to hit that breakpoint and investigate the more details that you need about that page. I hope this discussion on how we can create a directive that manipulates the DOM has been helpful to you. I tried my best to discuss it in a lot of details, and you can see there's a lot of details that are part of that page, and there are some stuff that we're not familiar with yet, but we will talk about services later. But again, I can see that the developer tools are very handy. Every time you're wondering on how something is happening, just hit that breakpoint and investigate the parameters by hovering them over them, or you can always interact with the console, and you can get that information that you need. So you can just type it in as I did in here. I hope this discussion has been helpful to you. There's more to come on Mr. Bull website. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Ayad Boudiab, and you take care.